So today we're going to be exploring 4 challenging concepts in JavaScript. And whether you're a beginner looking just to expand your understanding or a seasoned developer aiming to reinforce your knowledge, these concepts here are crucial to master JavaScript. Alright, and without further ado, let's jump into the code examples to get a hands-on understanding of these concepts. And feel free to follow along, and if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments section below, and I will do my best answering all of your questions as soon as possible. And with that being said, let's get started. Now, if we're going to talk about closures, simply we need to understand how functions can close over variables. And let me give you an example. Let's say that I want to create a function and I'm gonna call it outer function. Now remember, this is the main function, if you will. And inside it, we're going to work a little bit. So what I want is to create a variable or to declare a variable. This variable, I'm gonna call it outer var. This is an outer variable that's accessed by the outer function. And let's give it an arbitrary value, let's say for instance 10. So outer var variable equals to 10. Now let me create another function. In this case, I want to call it inner, right? That's logical. An outer function, and inside it there is an inner function. And this inner function is going to simply console log the outer var. So this outer var is the variable that it's accessed by this outer function, and we have a nested function which is the inner, and this outer var actually is outside of that inner function scope. It's inside that outer function, but it's getting more interesting. Now let's say for instance that I want to return the inner, right? So I want to return that inner function when we invoke the outer function. So return inner, and that's it. That's the end of that outer function. So let's review that again. We have an outer function. Inside it, we have a variable called outer var, which is equal to 10. We have another inner function that basically console.log the outer var variable, which is outside of this inner function. And finally, we return that inner function. So let me invoke that outer function by creating or declaring a variable, and I'm going to call it closure function. And I'm gonna assign to this variable this outer function. So typically now we have this closure function. We can invoke it and it should work. Now, what do you expect when we will invoke this function? Well, let's go ahead and see. We have an output of 10. So let's get back to our example and explain a little bit. When the inner function is defined inside that outer function, it forms what we call a closure. Okay, I'm gonna repeat that again. When we define this inner function inside that outer function, now we have a closure. In simpler terms, the inner function closes over the variable outer var, meaning that it maintains the access to the outer var even if the outer function has done executed. Next on the list, we have asynchronous JavaScript promises and async await. So, asynchronous programming is very important for handling tasks like fetching data from a server without blocking the execution of other code. Promises and async await are key concepts in handling asynchronous operations. Also, you might be familiar with something like Ajax. If you're using jQuery, it's also part of the asynchronous programming in JavaScript. In Python, for instance, we have async.io library, which was introduced lately to Python, several years ago. So the concept of asynchronous programming in general is very important to understand how we can handle tasks without blocking the execution of other tasks working or other code being run. Now, let me create a function that will return a promise that resolves after 2 seconds. So I'm gonna call this function fetch data. And this function is going to return a new promise. And this promise takes, as you can see on the screen, 2 things: in case of resolve and in case of reject. So we're going to return a promise in case that the promise is resolved after 2 seconds. To do that, I'm going to have here my input, resolved and reject. Then we are going to return set timeout because we need that after 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds, right? So inside here, I'm going to resolve, and we can say something like data is fetched. And we need that, as you said, after 2 seconds. And as you can see, we don't have any data to be fetched. So I'm going to substitute the resolve with simply console.log data is fetched. And below here, I'm going to call that method. Right. So let's go ahead and try that. Let's do node async.js, 2 seconds, and data is fetched, which is not well written, by the way. Right, 2 seconds, data is fetched. We have another method which is async await. So let me show you here the async await. So async functions using await to handle promises in a synchronous style. So I'm going to use the keyword async followed by the function keyword, and the name of the function is getData. Now this function, what it will do, it's going to try to console log this fetch data actually. So what I will do is I'm going to declare a variable. I'm going to call it result, and this result is going to await on fetch data function to be done with execution. And then finally, we'll do console.log the result. But in this case, I want to stop that console.log. It was just for demonstration, but we want to do resolve again. So getData function is going to try to do that. And in case of any errors, we're going to catch them. And we're going to console.log the error itself. And then down here below, we're going to invoke that getData. Now let's go ahead and run our file. So let's do node async.js. Now 2 seconds, and we have data is fetched. The bottom line for asynchronous programming here is we are handling tasks like here, for instance, we have fetch data, assuming that we have data to fetch from a server or to run a file or run on a database or fetch data from database or API or whatever it could be. We don't want to block the input-output process, right? So that's where the promises and async await and fetch API, by the way, also is a kind of asynchronous JavaScript methodology to return or handle these tasks without blocking any execution of other code. Right? So hopefully this is clear to you. And with that being said, let's go ahead to the other point, which is the prototypal inheritance. Now, JavaScript uses prototypal inheritance, where the objects can inherit properties and methods from other objects. If you come from Python background, this is very, very similar to classes and inheritance in Python classes. And as Python is an object-oriented programming language, the concept itself allows a class, or called a subclass or derived class, to inherit the properties and methods from another class. So if you have a class, for instance, with different methods, you can create another class and you can inherit those methods without reinitializing them. Just you are taking or you are inheriting from the previously initial class. That's exactly what we can do here in JavaScript. And to make the idea clear, I'm going to create a constructor function here, and I'm gonna call it animal. So we have a constructor function animal, and it has a name. This name equals to name. So we have this constructor function to create an animal object. Good. Now we can add a method to the animal prototype. How we can do that? Well, we can take the animal class and we can access prototype function or property sound, for instance. For the animal to bark, though, that's going to be equal to a function that just console.log, we can say some generic sound. Now with that initial animal class, we can create an animal object. So we can create a dog object, for example. So we can do function dog that also takes name, and here we're going to call the animal constructor with the current dog instance. So I'm gonna say animal dot call this name, and with that I've actually created a dog object. Now what I want is I want to set the dog's prototype to an instance of the animal's prototype. In other words, I want to inherit the dog's prototype from the animal's prototype. So let's try to do that. I'm gonna say dog.prototype is going to be set to object.method called create, and that takes the constructor or the class itself. In our case is the animal.prototype. And that dog prototype, I want to fix the constructor property for it. So we'll say dog.prototype.constructor is going to be set to the dog object. So remember that we have here the sound that the animal.prototype.sound. It has a function that consoles.log some generic sound. But here we want to override the sound method. Now we can do dog.prototype.sound equal to function and console.log, and it's going to bark. And that's going to be very specific to the dog because the umbrella of animal can have different animals and each animal can have different sound. So for instance, we have created a dog and that sound is going to be bark. Now let's get outside of that constructor and create an instance for a dog. So let's create an instance of a dog. So here essentially we are instantiating that dog class by creating my dog object. So my dog, that's the object, and we are instantiating using the new keyword and our class, which is dog, and takes name, right? Remember, we have here name as an input in animal and as in the dog class. And I want to display the sound of my dog. So I need my dog to display that sound, which is bark. So dot sound. And you can see that sound is actually the method that's going essentially to console.log bark. Right, so my sound. All right, so let's go ahead and try that. Let's do node inheritance, if I can write that, bark, perfect. Now let's talk about event loops and concurrency model. So understanding the event loop and JavaScript's concurrency model in general is very important to develop efficient and non-blocking code. The event loop helps you actually in handling asynchronous operations and avoiding performance bottlenecks. So let me give you an example. I'm going to use the setTimeout function to demonstrate the event loop. So here I want to log the start of our script, for instance. So logging the start of the script. So simply I'm going to console.log start. Okay. Now I want to schedule a timeout callback in the event loop. So we'll say set timeout. And here I'm going to just have a callback function. And this callback function is going to console.log say timeout callback. All right. And we'll have 0 seconds or 0 milliseconds. And so now I want to schedule a promise resolution in the event loop. So I'm going to use the promise dot resolve, and you can see if just I will return back just to show you. So the resolve is a promise constructor method, and this creates a new resolved promise. So that's not all actually, because we will need dot then. And dot then, as you can see here, that you know, this callback hell, if you will, this dot then, it's the primitive or the first idea to create promises, dot then. So dot then here is going to console.log, and here we'll say promise resolved. And finally, we'll do console.log end. Right. So let me show you what this actually does. Let's run node event loop. And before running that, try to understand or try to imagine what will happen. Right? Ready? Okay, let's go. Start, end, promise resolved, and timeout callback. So this was the order actually. Start and then end. Those were the console.log. Then promise resolved, which is scheduling the promise resolution. And finally the timeout callback, which was our scheduling for the timeout callback in our event loop. Let me show you again. So the start and the end were displayed. So this was displayed. Then next, this one here, console.log end was displayed. Then promise resolved, because we haven't actually blocked anything in the event loop. So notice here that this set timeout method with a 0 delay and the promise.resolve.then will be scheduled in the event loop, which demonstrates how they are executed asynchronously, while the main execution of the start and end just continues normally. Alright guys, so this is the end of this video. I hope the concepts are clear to you now. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them in the comments below. Share the video if you find it useful. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching the whole video. I appreciate it, guys. And yeah, with that, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.